there's this sense in which Russia will dial up things. Its risk tolerance is much higher now because it sees itself in conflict. It will do things which are very risky, and that can go too far. And I think the signs are that it may have pulled back from that kind of activity, partly because it got the message. This has very serious risks of escalating into something which Russia fundamentally doesn't really want to trigger a war through these activities. So each side is kind of calibrating responses to try and assert to the other side that it wants to deter that activity, but not carry out actions which might escalate it. And that's quite a difficult thing to get right. And I think that's definitely one of the worries.
And it's also quite a difficult thing to deter, right? I mean, when I think of the contrast, I spent many years in Beijing as a correspondent for us. And I remember conversations with Chinese, in some cases officials, certainly Chinese sort of scholars, saying, look, we don't have a full alliance with Russia because they do stuff that is just very reckless. They're not nearly as cautious as we are. China is a very calculating, very cautious power. It's, it thinks about every kind of step that it takes when it's bullying. So if Russia is this kind of somewhat undisciplined or kind of risk accepting kind of country, how does the West deter that?
Well, I think it is a challenge. And I think you also put yourself into the Russian mindset, which it's worth doing, which is they see themselves as under siege. They see themselves as under attack. They see the Ukrainians, who they see, of course, as Western allies, attacking their homeland, carrying out drone attacks, explosions, targeting air bases, things like that. So in their mind, they are trying to push back at that. So you can see each side feels it needs to push back. So it requires both a level of resilience, I think, rather than just deterrence, because I think Western societies are going to have to come to terms with the fact these kind of activities will continue. We're going to see, reconnaissance and perhaps sabotage on a much larger scale. We're going to see cyber attacks. We're going to see kind of arson attacks. These are going to become part of life. And I think they are becoming part of life, much more in some countries, like, for instance, Poland, but also the UK, and talked about Russia interfering in democratic life, trying to stir up tensions, trying to stir up protests, anti-immigrant feeling. These are the realities. So it's quite hard to stop Russia doing that, but it may be more about building up the defences and the awareness to detect it and to be able to cope with it, because I think it is just a reality.
Do you pick up discussions on the Western side about why are we always on defense here? Why are we not trying to make trouble in Russia?
Well, it's very interesting because, the Russians are convinced that the Western services are. I mean, they've long been convinced that Western services try and stir up ethnic tensions within Russia, and particularly also around Central Asia and the bordering countries. And so in the Russian mind, the West is already doing it. So there are some people in the West who say, well, maybe we should do it, given the Russians, believe we're doing it. There's very little cost in actually us doing it.
You don't think it's currently happening? There aren't like disinformation campaigns or sabotage
It's
campaigns?
harder to see the same kind of activity. I think if you were in Russia, though, they would say, well, we are seeing sabotage campaigns.
But done by Ukraine.
Done by Ukraine. Yeah. But they would say Ukraine is a Western ally, and things are, Russian airports are being disrupted by drones. Yeah. Drones are being flown at the Kremlin. Drones are exploding, at Russian air bases, blowing up bombers. So we are already seeing that kind of activity, but done through the West's proxy in their mind, which is Ukraine. Right. So that is the Russian mindset, that it is already happening. So it is that idea that there is basically a low-level conflict, not a war, but conflict, which is going on with Russia at the moment. I think we should see it in those terms. And I think part of the problem is the West has this binary war versus peace. It comes from some of our legal and our, kind of historical traditions to have it in that binary way, whereas actually that is not the reality of the modern world. The modern reality is a continuum of conflict, at different levels, with all-out war at the very highest end. And we're in that continuum.
And it's fascinating how that's kind of blending with that kind of gig economy thing. Is someone a taxi driver, or are they, someone with their own car? Well, they're an Uber driver. It's kind of halfway. And here it's the same thing, right? It's not an army on the battlefield. It's not a professional spy, but it's not exactly just a kind of street thug, because they are being hired over Telegram. It's very hard to fight, right?
It is very hard to fight, and the Russians are using interesting techniques. They're using Ukrainians, so often people who are pro-Russian Ukrainians, or Ukrainians who are just being paid to carry out some of the attacks around Europe. We're seeing quite a bit of that in Europe. And of course, then the idea is to stir up the idea, well, it's the Ukrainians' fault, and to try and, to undermine support for Ukraine. So I think, there's a spectrum there also with political interference, and the support for different political ideas and groups and individuals, which we've seen in Europe as well, which again is part of that Russian playbook, which they're very, very aggressive at using at the moment.
Is there a sense for today's Russia, because they feel like the underdog under siege, that kind of the worse things are, the more chaotic things are in the world, kind of the better for Russia, because they're just better at coping with chaos? Is that?
Yeah, and that's the difference, which is why China is so different. China fundamentally wants a stable order.
Wants it to be,
but it wants to be their order.
And subverted by China.
Their order and an economic order in which there's trade. Russia, I think, views the current order as a Western order. It wants to break that apart, certainly. And this idea of a kind of getting away from a unipolar world into a multipolar world is the kind of language they use. But it is basically about the view that the West is a perpetual enemy, and therefore to keep it off balance, divided, weak, and to undermine any institutions which it backs. That gives Russia, in its view, room to operate in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise.